The real work isn't taking place when we're gathered. The real work's taking place when we're scattered. Just like the real excitement of the football game is not the halftime talk, it's what's going on the field. There are a lot of people out there that are really bored. It's because they've somehow been told the halftime talk, that's the main bit. And actually that's only the preparation for the main bit.
Hi everybody, this is Simon Gilbert with Inspired. There's so much bad news out there and we want to counteract that with great news of stirring stories of triumphant faith, of overcoming, of hanging on in there, of perseverance, of creativity. And there are so many different journeys that we've highlighted in the last number of months, and I'm really excited today to have a fantastic guest with us, and that is Dr. Krish Kandiah. It's hard to know what to say about Krish. I mean, we've connected a few times over the years. I think it was at Summer Madness speaking, that might have been about 10, 15 years ago, I don't know, and then again at Spring Harvest. But Krish is a social entrepreneur, broadcaster, speaker, consultant. When I look at your website, Krish, it is hard to know. I think a lot of us would know you for the book Paradoxology. You've written a number of books, but that was an absolute cracker. And then Krish was the founder of Homes for Good, which is a charity working to make a real difference in the lives of vulnerable children by finding loving homes for children in the care system. There's loads more to say. I mean, I'd love to touch on your recent venture, which is Sanctuary Foundation, helping to coordinate hosts with Ukrainian refugees. There's so much that you're involved in terms of teaching at various universities and stuff like that. But listen, Krish, why don't we just crack in? Well, actually, yesterday I was looking at your TEDx talk, Can Hospitality Change the World? And I thought we'd start there, just because in that you talk about your father. So that gives a chance for us to unpack sort of your roots and family backgrounds. So where did it all start?
Oh, well, I was born in Brighton. And my mother was born in India. My father was born in Malaysia. My father's father was born in Sri Lanka, and my mother's father was born in Ireland. So I'm not quite sure where it all started. It's a pleasure to speak with you, Simon, and looking forward to exploring. You can help me kind of work out who I am and where I'm from in this podcast, if you like.
So in that you showed a picture of an Indian man and a British, a white guy next to him. I think it was a tiger and it wasn't a trophy kill. It was the fact that guy the tiger had been marauding through the village. And I suppose the expectation, because you're
I'm brown.
You're brown. What's the correct terminology? So you said the question, who's the dad? And actually, your dad was the British guy, but you said he was a real man of integrity, wasn't he?
Yeah. This is my granddad in India. So he was a crack shot with a rifle, and when there was a marauding tiger, he was the one that was called in to sort it out. And he ended up signing up for the Indian Army and died in El Alamein in North Africa, providing covering fire for his troops. He won a military cross for that. So because my mother was mixed race, her and her sisters were taken into an orphanage, even though they had a living mother. And my mum told me pretty horrific stories of what it was like growing up in an orphanage. I had always had a plan that one day, when my wife and I had done our best to help the foster children in our care and, sort out as best we could the UK care system, we would retire into somewhere else in the world and run an orphanage. But weirdly, the penny never dropped that my mother had a terrible time in an orphanage. And it took a long journey, actually, for me to realise that orphanages are just not a great way for anyone to be helping children, that we need to be helping kids stay in families. But anyway, that's a digression, because my mum grew up in this orphanage, and it ended up being her grand aunt that reunited the family, brought them to the UK. My mum ends up training to be a nurse in Brighton. That wasn't without its challenges. It wasn't a very multicultural space, Brighton in the 1950s and 60s, and faced a lot of racism, actually, that white patients wouldn't let my mother touch them because they thought that she was somehow dirty or broken, and asked for a white nurse to come in instead. And it was really tough for her, but she launched this one-woman resistance campaign, which was to open up her house on a Friday night, cook up a massive vat of curry and rice, and invite anyone that felt like they didn't fit in to come and have dinner. And that's how she met my dad, and the rest is history.
And was that driven by her faith?
Well, she had a really interesting faith. Her faith was really knocked by the fact it was nuns that were running the orphanage that she grew up in, and they were pretty brutal.
Okay.
So she had to sleep, face up with her hands in a prayer-like position, and if she didn't, she got her feet whacked with a cane.
Oh, dear.
So can you imagine that? Someone controlling the posture that you have when you're sleeping.
Yeah.
So that really kind of had a massive negative influence on my mother's faith. If she kind of hated institutionalized religion for a long time after that. Because she'd had an experience of institutional care run by institutional religion. So you could see why she might become anti-institutional. My mum came to faith very late in her life, but had helped me a little bit as a young person learn to pray. She didn't believe in institutional religion, but taught me to pray, and that was part of my own spiritual journey.
And again, the TEDx talk, you share us some of the beautiful stories of her taking in sort of people you wouldn't really think was wise.
Yeah. My mum was brilliant. So, one of my favourite stories is we get a knock at the door. It's late at night, and I'm a teenager. I'm pretending to do homework, but I'm probably watching TV. And my mum gets to the door first. She opens the door, and there's this huge guy filling up the door frame, and he says, "Oh, hello." I can't remember her name now. Does Katie live here? And my mum goes, "No." And he says, "Oh, look, I'm looking for Katie. I've just arrived into the UK from Germany into Gatwick Airport, and I was chatting to this girl on the plane, and as I was going through customs after we'd said goodbye, I realised I had something to declare. It's my undying love for Katie, but I don't know where she lives." And this is way before mobile phones or Twitter or Instagram or whatever. So all he knew was she lived in Brighton. So he was going door to door in Brighton trying to find Katie. Mm-hmm. And I would have thought that was creepy enough to slam the door and, lock it as many times as we could. But my mother goes, "Well, you better come in then." So she cooks,
Beautiful.
She makes him a nice cup of Indian tea, and he tells more of his story. And before we know it, he's sleeping in our lounge, which was great for him, but bad for me because my bedroom was opposite the lounge. And as a teenager, I'd take every bit of furniture that I can move, and I build a barricade, and I get under my duvet, and I got my Swiss Army knife out for protection. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that if he tried my door and couldn't get in, he'd probably go upstairs, and cause some bother up there. But anyway, I must have been very narcissistic and selfish back then. But anyway, I wake up the next morning. I haven't cut myself with my Swiss Army knife, and I managed to de-barricade my door, and I can hear snoring from the front room. The German guy is still there. All our, valuables, however small they were, are still there too. And, my mum cooks him a big breakfast and sends him on his way. And I've got this romantic belief that there's this German-English couple out there somewhere that when they tell the tale of how they got together, they talk about the hospitality of a little Indian woman from Brighton called June. But she really modelled to me just radical hospitality, and it's been a defining theme of my life and my family's life, ever since.
Yeah, it's your inherited DNA, isn't it? Did it ever spectacularly backfire?
It didn't really. Maybe there were door-to-door salesmen that knew my mum would kind of basically say yes. So I think we bought this massive... who buys a carpet from a door-to-door salesman, right? And she opened it up and it was all like, little bits, offcuts that were no use to anybody. But right. So, yeah, you're right. Sometimes people could take advantage of you. But in general, no, that was probably the worst thing that happened to us.
Right. So what was your journey then to faith?
So my mum's teaching me to pray, and, a few of the Bible stories are there. I've got this friend of my mother's who's Auntie Sue. She's not really an auntie, but she's kind of bought me and my sister a Bible because she wants us to kind of know something about her faith. But it was one Sunday afternoon, and I heard what I thought was an earthquake going on outside my house. And I look outside the window, and it isn't an earthquake. It's the big bass drum of a Salvation Army marching band. Oh, wow. And when you're a small boy, that is the coolest thing that you've seen in a long time. So out I go, and I just am bewitched by a brass band that's marching up and down our hill. And, I asked my mum if I could go wherever they were from. And turns out there was a little Salvation Army church round the corner from us. And so I started to go to Sunday school. And I remember one Sunday, in the kind of way that the Salvation Army used to do, they encouraged you that if you wanted to give your heart to Jesus, and I wasn't quite sure about how organ donation to a spiritual figure worked, but, I thought, yeah, great. I think I understand something, that he died for me and I'm going to respond to what I understand. And so out I went, and the Salvation Army had this thing at the front of even in the Sunday school, called a mercy seat, which is where you would go and you'd kneel and you'd ask for God to come and forgive you and kind of, help you rebuild your life. And a little Salvation Army lady with her uniform and little bonnet on kind of would come and kind of counsel me at the front there. And I don't think I fully understood it all, but that was important to me. And then I go to secondary school a few years later, and I meet this lad, and he had been at a John Wimber event. He was a charismatic evangelist at the Brighton Centre. And this lad stands up at the front of the class after the teacher had nipped out to have a quick smoke, leaving 30 teenage boys in charge of a chemistry lab. Really bad idea. And he says to the class, he says, look, something amazing happened to me last night. I became a friend of God. And, it's amazing. It's the most amazing thing I can tell you about. And I want you to know about it too. If you've got any questions, come and see me. And I thought that was, I suppose, equally the stupidest and bravest thing I'd ever seen anyone do.
Brave, yeah.
So I go up to him afterwards and said, look, it sounds like you're new to this Christianity thing. I've been doing it for a while. It's private and personal. You don't talk about it. It's just between you and God. And this lad, Steve, he says, Krish, if you knew the God that I met last night, you wouldn't be able to be quiet about it. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. That's not what I know. I've got something, but it doesn't seem to be what you've got. And he's explaining this radical relationship with God. And I've got churchianity. I've got a really, thin grasp of the Christian message, but he's got living relationship, and I'm in, right? So, I want what he has, and he kind of talks me through it a little bit more. And then we think, okay, this is great. If God really does want to forgive us, if Jesus really did die on the cross, if he really did come back to life again, then the world needs to know about this. So me and Steve, we divide the class into two. He takes all the children whose surnames are A to L, and I take M to Z, and we're going to try and tell him about it. And we were the worst people in the world at this.
Brilliant.
I was relatively strong. I played rugby, and I was small but strong, and would use that physical strength to challenge lads to kind of think about God. And I learned the hard way how not to help people encounter Jesus, but they did raise a lot of questions. So they kept saying things like, how do you know the devil didn't write the Bible? And what about science? And did Jesus really rise from the dead? And so that drove me back to actually read the Bible that Auntie Sue had given me. And I'm suddenly got my yellow highlighter pen, and I'm highlighting all the good bits. And actually, they're only good bits. And so my Bible's just soaked in highlighter.
How old are you at this stage?
Loads and loads of questions. I'm 15.
Right.
And, between me, Steve, and some schools workers that were coming to our school, we start up a little Christian group, and we're just trying our best to explain what the Christian faith means to us. We made loads and loads of mistakes. We're rubbish at it. But quite a few of our classmates begin to profess faith, and something's going on, and we get excited.
Oh, wow, brilliant. And, well, God bless Steve. Are you still tracking with him?
Yeah, Steve's a pastor with what was called New Frontiers. So he's up in Hull. And I helped his wife become a Christian when I was at sixth form. She wasn't his wife then, she was just a girl. And, she came to faith, which was amazing. We did a little study in John's Gospel, I think it was. Each week we'd meet up and try and open the Bible up and understand who Jesus was. And she got it and became a Christian. And they got married and had a son, and, been pastors up in the north of England for a long time now.
Wonderful. So was it plain sailing up through sixth form?
Well, yes and no. I had a loving family. I really messed up trying to explain my faith to my mum and dad. I think my mum it did help. She kind of starts to reboot her understanding of God, that it's not just this cruel institution that she'd experienced as a child, but there was this living relationship with God. My dad's from a Hindu background, and I think I was very arrogant and naive and bossy, and I made loads of mistakes, so it didn't really help him come to faith. But he was open to what was happening to me and let me express that, so that was great. I really wanted to go to Russia as a missionary,
right?
Because this is before the Berlin Wall was coming down, and so I'm reading Russian. I'm doing Russian summer camps, and going and learning Russian, and working with a group called Agape that were doing little trips to help teenagers experience cross-cultural mission. Really passionate. I'm going, okay, I want to study Russian and philosophy at university. And my dad's like, no way, you'll never get a job in that. You need to study a science. Right. And I'd read the bit in the Bible about being honouring your father and mother. And I thought, you know what, maybe I better obey on that one. So I decided I'm going to study chemistry. And that was the kind of next phase of my life. I go to university. I meet my now wife. I did study Russian in my spare time, carried on going to Russia in summer camps and mission trips. And Berlin Wall comes down, don't need my chemistry degree to be a kind of undercover scientist missionary, but still interested in what we can do. And by the time I'm finishing uni, and I'm doing quite a lot of work with university students with a group called UCCF or IFES, we think students might be a good place for us to work because that's our experience, and maybe we could be useful. And we end up going to Albania. That was our first deployment. And I said, but I speak Russian already. And they said, well, if you only go to countries that you speak the language of, that's going to be quite limited. And I thought, okay, fair point. So Albania had been the most atheist country in the world. They'd banned all forms of religion. You couldn't even call your son John. You couldn't have a beard because that was a religious sign. And we think, okay, maybe we could be useful there.
I've done some ministry in Albania, and that my favourite statistic is that in 1991, so at the end, just before the revolution, there were 24 cars in the whole country. Isn't that mind-blowing?
That's good.
That's the nuts statistic. And we stayed with literally the first Carolee Loring. We say the first female driver in the whole nation. I mean, that's just bizarre. Wow. But it was so close, and then it massively opened up, didn't it? And
it did.
So chemistry. You've also got degrees in missiology and theology. So chemistry, I mean, I suppose you're glad you did chemistry just because that meant you met your wife. And went to
that was definitely the best bit about studying chemistry. Finding some chemistry with my wife.
Did she know what she was getting herself into?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, no one fully knows what you get yourself into.
Sure.
I was really involved with the Christian Union. We ran a big kind of Bible study group for people that wanted to explore faith, and loads of first-year students were running, studies to help introduce people to Jesus through the Gospel of John. And we had like hundreds of students doing that, and she got involved with that. And we started dating just as she left to go to Germany for a year out. So our romance was epistolary. We'd just write to each other, which is probably good for everybody. But yeah, we got married after the end of uni, and we then went and were missionaries together in Albania.
How long was that for?
We were there for 3 years, and our job was to kind of set up an Albanian-run student movement. So we had to build a board, we had to train up Albanian national staff, and there is still a student movement in Albania. By the grace of God. They've been doing fantastic work. One of the students that came to faith before we arrived actually in Albania ended up leading the movement and doing an amazing job. And it's just wonderful to see what God's been doing there.
Any key story from that time to share?
Albania? Oh my goodness, yeah. We made every mistake in the book. We were 20-somethings trying to, lead a group of university graduates, working with a cross-cultural team of Brits, an American and an Albanian. I'm pretty sure we made every mistake that we could have made. And I guess one of the reasons I ended up studying missiology was a little bit of a sense of despair at what had happened on the mission field. So Albania, as we said, was one of the most atheist countries in the world. And when it opened up, everybody went to Albania.
Yeah.
And there was every flavour of Christian denomination you could imagine. I think there was something like 11 Baptist churches in Tirana. And, you know, there was the First Baptist Church, and they're like the moon landing team, aren't they? They're the ones that get the flag in first and go, right, we're the first ones. And then there was a breakdown with the First Baptist Church, and there was a kind of charismatic group that wanted to become the Spirit Baptist Church. And then there was a group that were annoyed with the Spirit Baptist Church for not doing enough Bible, and so there was the Word and Spirit Baptist Church. And, you know, and then every other group was there, and you know, my wife ended up running the Albanian Literature Centre, and every book that had been translated into Albanian was in this literature centre, and you know, it was a kind of one-stop shop so you could see what was out there. And the bizarre thing was that everybody had an axe to grind and was publishing books. So there were books against, I don't know, young Earth creationism, or for young Earth creationism, before there was a reasonable commentary on the Book of Genesis, or there was books from pretty kind of way out there fringe theologians before we had some of the, you know, the basic tools that you might actually need to build theological depth. Really, and that was really sad. And the sad thing for me was Albania was held up as one of the best places of missionary unity. And I thought, if this is the best, like, what's going on? And so what I wanted to do then is to go, okay, look, maybe we need a bit more depth. There's something exciting about activism and being crazy pragmatic and just getting stuff done, but maybe we need some depth. And so that's why I wanted to study some more theology. So I did my master's and then my PhD on missiology. And, you know, we need both, don't we? We need breadth and depth. We need people that can go fast, and we need people that can go deep, and we need those people to work together. And often we separate, and people go, oh, we don't need theology, we just need action. All the theologians say, we just need theology, we don't need action. Well, actually, you need both. And, you know, you look at the early church and they managed that, didn't they? You look at the incredible, rich depth of Paul's letters, and yet I've never met a stronger activist on the planet. Like, how did he manage it? How did Jesus manage it? So I think that's where the body principle comes in for me, that we really need the gung-ho, let's change the world activist, but we also need the thoughtful, reflective teachers to kind of work together. And when they come together in one person, that's great, but we still need both of those giftings.
Yeah, and I mean, it looks like you're embodying and modelling that pretty well yourself. So yeah, it's crucial, isn't it? Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. Moving on, post Albania, where did was home for good soon after that, or skipping some years?
No, and it's weird, isn't it? Because you look back, and I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I wanted to study some more theology, and I wanted to do that within a church context. I think theology is always best done on the run. Paul didn't spend 20 years in a kind of theological college. He was doing his missionary journeys while he's writing. In fact, one theory was God had to put him in prison in order for him to have time to write these beautiful, deep letters. So he's doing it on the run, he's in action, and I thought, okay, that could be a good model. And so I ended up working as an assistant pastor while I did my master's, and then working as a pastor while I did my PhD. And it was all about mission and, communicating the gospel and figuring out how to cross some of the cultural divides and the theological divides. And I ended up going to lecture at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. And looking back, it was a very, very traumatic time, and I hadn't figured out quite why it was. But recent revelations about Ravi Zacharias make sense of it to me now. So I was jointly employed by the RZIM, as it was called, and Wycliffe Hall, which is a theological college in Oxford, and I was helping to run something called the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And there was a brokenness about the culture there that left me just reeling. Actually, I talk about it in one of my books, obliquely, that I never had anything like depression, but there was something toxic about the environment, and I couldn't put my finger on what it was, and I was not coping well. And so, I wasn't, at one stage I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating properly, I was in the room but not really present. And the thing that actually really changed me, a little bit like studying chemistry was best for meeting my wife, the best thing that happened out of that season was that we became adoptive parents. We'd had 3 birth kids already. We became adoptive parents, and that really was the journey that led to Home for Good.
Right. And had you discussed adopting before getting married?
Yeah, we had, and apparently lots of people do, because most of us recognise there are children that are out there that don't have families. And, we'd talked about it. We'd even talked about the orphanage thing because we were quite young and naive and idealistic about it. And then, life kind of takes over. We end up having children and it went off the back burner and, not in our imagination anymore. And then one of my old mentors from uni, who ended up being the head of student ministries at UCCF, him and his wife became foster carers in their 60s. And that really challenged me. They were taking on teenagers in, a kind of challenging phase in their lives. And then I became aware of some of the stats around foster care, just how many children needed, loving, permanent family. And what happens if kids don't get that? They age out of care. They're more likely to be criminalised, exploited, imprisoned, homeless. And I thought, oh my goodness, we need to do something about that. And somehow, despite finishing a PhD in theology, being a cross-cultural missionary, I'd missed all the bits the Bible had talked about God being a father to the fatherless and a protector of widows and orphans. And looking back now, I can't believe how I missed it. But we get in these kind of theological ghettos, don't we? These little tribes where certain things become more important than others, and we miss some of the big picture ideas, and suddenly these parts of the Bible are jumping out at me. And my wife's going, well, I think we should become foster carers or adoptive parents, and that was how the journey began for us.
I see on Home for Good's website, the big stat straight away they come up with is every 15 minutes a child comes into care in the UK. I mean, that's just such a bleak thought, but we don't want to sort of just get depressed, do we? And, all it takes for evil to prosper is for good people to do nothing. That was
that's right.
So I guess you're just trying to mobilise as many people as possible. Give us not a sales pitch, but give us an exhortation. What can this look like?
So look, the Bible is really clear what God values in terms of our love and care for Him is expressed in how we love and care for others. And if we don't love our neighbour, then we don't love God. The Bible makes that a package deal. And, too often our faith is just directed at God. People that are told, close your eyes and whatever kind of week you've had, just forget about that. Let's just focus on God. I'm going, that is actually sub-biblical Christianity. The Bible never says close your eyes and just focus on God. It always says love God, love your neighbour. And the verse that really hooked me on this whole thing, and I'm always nervous about building a whole theology on a verse, but it was a gateway verse and passage that led me to the rest of what Scripture's been teaching on this, was James 1:27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and blameless is to care for widows and orphans in their distress. And you go, okay, hold on. If God was assessing the worship of His people, the top priority is how we care for the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And, you know, a widow, an orphan, and in the Old Testament, it gets extended to include the stranger. That's the kind of triumvirate that gets repeated over and over again, are people that don't have an advocate, that don't have someone that could speak up for them, that's going to take care of them. In the ancient world, in a patriarchal society, a widow had very little rights. It was difficult for her to earn a living and to survive without a husband. That was just the way the world was back then. And so widows were vulnerable. God says, I'm going to take care of the widow. I'm going to be like a husband to the widow. I'm going to take them under my wing and care for them. And you see that in a beautiful story like Ruth and Naomi. You know, God really looked after them in a beautiful way. And then the orphan, you know, an orphan in biblical language actually doesn't mean a child whose both parents are dead. It just means a child not living under the care of their father. Right. And that idea, again, because in a patriarchal society, that made you vulnerable. Who's going to take you under the shadow of their wing? How is that going to work out? And God says, look, I will do that. I'll be a protector of widows and orphans. And the stranger, again, as a foreigner in a strange land, who would speak up for you? Who would give you shelter? Who would show you hospitality? Those are the ideas. So in James 1:27, we're told, you know, that's what religion looks like to God. That's what pure, unadulterated, God-pleasing religion looks like. And if you took that as the benchmark of what our faith needs to express, how does that compare with what we often tell people Christianity is about? You know, think about some of the presentations of the gospel that we give. We tell people that it's about having your sins forgiven or going to heaven when you die. And you go, that's only like a quarter of the story. We've missed out so much of it. Yeah. Or, you know, think about what we actually do when we gather. Most of the time we gather, we're singing songs and we're listening to speaking. And that's important, but only in the way that a half-time football coaching session should be. You know, the real work isn't taking place when we're gathered. The real work's taking place when we're scattered. Yeah. Just like the real excitement of the football game is not the half-time talk, it's what's going on the field. So, you know, we've somehow replaced ritual for righteousness. We've swapped doing the work of the kingdom for talking about it. And you know, we do need to gather, we do need to sing, we do need to pray, we do need to read the Bible, but only in the extent it equips us for doing the actual work. And God tells you what it is. It's to love your neighbour as yourself. It's to care for the widow and orphan. That's what religion is about. So there are a lot of people out there that are really bored. They're bored of Christianity. They're bored of the church. It's because they've somehow been told the half-time talk, that's the main bit. And actually that's only the preparation for the main bit.
That is really helpful, that analogy. Never heard that before. Brilliant. So you took on, you had a 6-year-old that came to you initially, is that right?
Well, so we had 3 kids. Our oldest child was 6 when we took on fostering and adoption. And our first foster child was a brand new baby that had just been born. Mum had had a really, really difficult life. All sorts of terrible things had happened to her in her past, and that had made it really difficult for her to have the capacity to care for this child. And so, you know, we did our best to be foster parents to this little one. And after many years of attempts to rehabilitate with Mum, we were asked if we would adopt the little one, and we became adoptive parents. And in the end, now we have 6 kids that live permanently with us, 3 that are our birth kids, and then 3 are fostered and adopted.
Wow. So what does family life look like and integrated with faith?
Yeah, that's a good question, Simon. It's busy. There's always stuff going on. And, you know, unlike movies like Despicable Me and Anne of Green Gables and Annie, it isn't all songs and sunshine. Children that have been brought into the care system have had something terrible happen to them. Yeah. And, you know, even if the child is removed at birth, there's a trauma of that separation from your birth family that doesn't really ever go away. And people thinking about fostering and adoption really need to go in eyes open. I spend a lot of my time not persuading people to do it, but warning people how hard it is. Yeah. I try to take a bit of approach like the Marines. You know, if you're looking for a holiday, the Marines are not where you go, but if you're looking for a life filled with challenge and meaning, then fostering adoption really is where you want to go, because you get to be drawn into the world of someone's trauma and challenge and difficulty, but you're doing it because you want to show love and compassion. You want to make a difference. And it is incredibly exciting, but it's incredibly challenging.
So at what stage did you found Home for Good?
Yeah, good question. So I was, you're getting into all my history, man. I was working for the Evangelical Alliance.
Yeah, that's what
and interesting days. Everybody wanted evangelicals to talk about sex and homosexuality and gay marriage, and I thought, you know what, that really isn't my most exciting conversation. Where Christians stand on that issue. I guess someone has to kind of figure that one out. But for me, when the Bible prioritizes compassion and care for people in need, that's where I think we ought to be focusing our attention. So we launched a little campaign. We'd become foster parents and adoptive parents, and we thought, you know what, there are thousands of kids that need loving homes. And we did the maths. We worked out when we started this campaign, there were around a shortage of 9,000 foster families and about 5,000 children that were waiting for adoption. And that's a big number. And that was just in the UK. And most of the children waiting for adoption were older. And by older, I mean 2 or 3.
Right.
And a lot of people coming into adoption see adoption as the third worst way to have a child. It's normally driven by infertility. So, natural birth's great. And for some people, IVF is the second thing you try. And if none of that works, there's always adoption. And when you come at adoption through infertility, you really want a brand new baby. And I get it. Babies are amazing. But the children that are actually waiting are older.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do is to say, look, this isn't about finding a child to meet your fertility needs. That makes you the centre and the child the means to the end. What about if we took a Christian approach, which is to put the needs of others ahead of our own? That's Philippians 2, isn't it? That's Jesus the servant king, and saying, look not only to our own interest but to the interests of others. What would that look like? That's caring about the widow and the orphan, not about my needs. And then suddenly a whole bunch of us, whether we can have our own birth kids or not, whether we're married or single, whether our kids have left home or they're in our home still, we could be brilliant parents for the children that are waiting. And when we thought about it, we thought, hold on, 5,000 kids waiting for adoption, 9,000 more foster families. Evangelical Alliance back then was in touch with at least 20,000 churches. So, that's just one family per church to become a foster parent or adoptive parent, the rest of the church to wrap around them, and we could meet the need. That's really doable. That's not asking everyone to adopt 100 kids. That's just one new family per church. And that was the idea that really got the campaign of Home for Good going. And it got legs, and people began to think, this is doable. People started to come forward and say, we've been fostering for ages, but our church hasn't been a help. It's been actually a hindrance. This is great. Maybe the church could get behind us. Or other people thought, we could do this for the first time. And we met millennials who were willing to think maybe adoption will be plan A for us. We won't even try to have our birth kids. We'll adopt first. And I said, well, kids are a gift from God. You do whatever you feel called to do, but sure, we'll support you if that's what you feel you're being called to do. And after a while, it was gathering such momentum that we really need to start a charity so it could be its own thing.
So that was what year?
Oh man, I'm rubbish at dates. It was about, I'd say 6 years ago, we started the process to become our own charity.
Right. And what sort of numbers of kids have you managed to help get integrated into families?
That's a really good question. I've learned a lot about performance and impact measurements since we started. I think in the early days, we just let the world know. We were like a megaphone to the church, and we called people to action, and people just found their own way to foster and adopt. And, I meet people every day. Like I was on the train last week into London, and a guy sitting opposite me goes, Mate, I read your name. I don't know if I had a badge on or he read it on my bag or something. He said, like, you inspired my parents to become foster parents.
Lovely.
And they, 5 years ago, you gave a talk at their church in Oxford. And, it's been great watching this little 6-year-old now, grow up in my family home. And
Beautiful.
so we have no idea how many people actually stepped forward, but it was significant enough that we began to get traction with the government and offer them solutions to how civil society, churches and other groups can play their part in finding loving homes for children. And that's why now I don't work for Home for Good anymore. I cheer them on from afar.
Yeah.
But I advise the government on adoption and something called special guardianship. That's when kids live with their aunties or uncles or grandparents. And I count it a real privilege to be able to try and influence government policy to help every child find the loving home they need.
Yeah, I love that. So so you're chairman of the Adoption and Special Guardianship Leadership Board. I love how you are obviously in the secular space, but unashamedly Christian. How does it work, sort of integrating faith in that context?
Well, in one sense, I had it really easy. I was leading a Christian charity, inspiring people into fostering and adoption and actually looking after refugee children who come here unaccompanied. And it was out of that I got this role in government. So I'd never had to do a big reveal. It was already out there from the beginning. And I find it's a real honour to work alongside people who are different. I work closely with Muslim colleagues or atheist colleagues or Jewish colleagues, and it's a privilege. And I can be who I am and be open about it, and I can try and show love and respect and kindness to people that I don't share all the same values with, but we have a common goal. We're all in it because we want children to find loving homes. So we have overlapping ambition. We have common ground on which we can build. And that's really great fun. I really enjoy that. And it means I can work with almost anybody that is willing to put the needs of children first. And, that's the best way I find to be able to collaborate.
Do you feel you have to tone down your faith a bit or not?
I think there's ways in which you can communicate what you are in a way that makes sense to people. So I often talk about Daniel. So Daniel is serving King Nebuchadnezzar. And did Daniel agree with King Nebuchadnezzar's politics? I'm pretty sure they were on completely different pages. And yet Daniel is a very loyal, gracious citizen and civil servant. And I'm not quite a civil servant, but I found ways to express, hopefully, my faith and my politics in a way that I can work with people that are really different to me. So I don't think I have to turn down anything about who I am. I'm just trying to find appropriate ways to build on that common ground.
Love it. I mean, I can relate on a number of levels. I mean, again, looking at your website, you say, what you're about helping to solve some of society's seemingly intractable problems through partnerships across civil society, faith communities, government and philanthropy. I'm doing that in a similar way in Burundi. So just a different context. It's, I love it. Sort of seeing potential synergies, getting groups together, creating win-wins. And
yeah, exactly right.
There's so much potential in everything is relationship. That'd be one of my mantras. And obviously you're brilliant at getting people behind an idea, at casting vision, at getting buy-in. We're running out of time, but I don't, if I've missed out anything, I mean, I'm sure I have, of that you'd really want to share after this question.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. But one thing I'm really intrigued by and excited by is how you've mobilized people around, and you just set up the last few months. Well, it's obviously very recent hot news, Sanctuary Foundation, to help coordinate hosts with Ukrainian refugees. Again, it's such a no-brainer, but it takes someone really being the mobilizer, catalytic sort of energizer to make things happen. So how did that happen?
Oh, I'll try and tell it as quick as I can. So back in 2015, when we had the Syrian refugee crisis, I'd had a little bit of experience working with refugees from Kosovo in the 1990s because of our time in Albania. And again, you never know how these things will all work out. I thought I was going to be a Russian missionary, end up going to Albania. There's a crisis in the country. The Kosovo crisis is going on. Come back to the UK. I'm pastoring a church in London. I'm walking down the street and I recognise a language, and it's some Kosovan people who speak Albanian. And I start speaking to them in Albanian, and they nearly jump out of their skin because I'm brown. Like, Asian brown people don't speak Albanian. That's nuts. Anyway, we end up running a little Kosovan support group for a few families, maybe 30 families in the area had become as refugees. And we ran language classes for them to keep hold of their Kosovan language, which had been exterminated or attempted to be exterminated by people they perceived to be Christians. And, we ran cultural events. A fabulous evening one night came when we put on this party with Kosovan music, Kosovan dancing and Kosovan food. And our church hall was just full of about 100 Kosovan people. Really sweaty, like there was condensation all around the windows. And some guy comes out of the hall and he says, "Look, I don't understand what's going on here. I'm dancing, I'm having a fantastic time. And on the wall it says, 'Jesus is Lord.' My understanding of Christianity was the Serbs that were trying to exterminate us Muslim people. But here I am, you've shown us hospitality. What's going on?" And I thought, oh my goodness, that's just a little bridge builder, isn't it? That someone can know not all Christians are trying to kill you. Christians are trying to show you love and compassion. Maybe there are different types of Christians, and there's real Christianity and there's fake Christianity, and this is a bridge builder, right? Anyway, so it was out of the experience of working with Kosovan refugees in the 90s. When the Syrian crisis happened, we thought that there must be something the church could do. We managed to mobilise people to consider becoming foster parents for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Our government had said that we would take 20,000 over 5 years. And we thought, well, where are you going to put them? There's already a shortage of foster carers. So we launched a little campaign at Home for Good to get people to do that. 8,000 people signed up for that over a weekend. It was crazy. The government didn't quite know how to make use of that offer. I learned a lot that, you can use that power of numbers to try and persuade government to do the right thing, but in the end it's their choice. So a few hundred people, I think, out of those thousands ended up becoming foster carers, some for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So, praise God for that, but it wasn't the numbers we wanted. And so when three things happened quite close in succession. So I stopped working for Home for Good. I started working for the government. I think, what am I going to do for the rest of my week? I'm only working 1 day a week. And then the UK opens its borders to 100,000 people from Hong Kong who were coming to the UK in the middle of a pandemic. And I thought, look, there's an opportunity here for the church to show welcome. And so we set up something called UKHK. It's still working today, trying to integrate and welcome new arrivals from Hong Kong to Britain. That was so successful that when the government was trying to evacuate Afghans from Kabul, they said, look, you mobilise the church and civil society on Hong Kong, could you help us with Afghans? I said, of course we could. So we set up something called Afghan Welcome, and that was a bunch of charities coming together to try and support Afghans. And most of those Afghans were put into hotels, 11,500 still there in hotels. They needed basics like, pushchairs and prams and a safe place for a child to sleep. They needed someone in the building just to offer them support and help. And, churches stepped up to do that, and it was brilliant. And then a number of weeks ago, the government said that we would welcome people from Ukraine. And they said there would be an uncapped refugee sponsorship program. And the word uncapped really caught my imagination. That meant for every sponsor we could find, a refugee family from Ukraine could come to the UK. And I knew there'd be appetite for it. So the best way I could think of influencing government was get people to volunteer for a scheme that didn't exist yet. And because that would be positive pressure for them to actually do it. And we had 11,000 people sign up to be sponsors before the sponsorship route was opened. And the government, bless them, opened the route, and now 200,000 people. They're not all my responsibility. We just did our little bit to kind of catalyse some of our communities, but it's caught fire. Loads of other people have got on board, and God's doing something, the culture's doing something, and it's fabulous how many people have been coming forward. And so now we're helping to advise the government, problem solve for the government,
in that kind of Daniel way. You know, Daniel is a wonderful servant, and yet he's driven by a passion to serve God. And that's us at Sanctuary. We're trying to mobilise anyone that will listen about how we can offer help and sanctuary to refugees from Ukraine. And, you know, rather than just get angry on Twitter or wag a finger, we're trying to find solutions. And it's been amazing. And people have been so generous with their time and their energy. You know, I am just a small cog in this thing, a little catalyst. And suddenly people are being so generous, so innovative. And my job is just to keep things moving along. So, you know, I just do what I can.
Oh, Krish, it's so encouraging. Listen, I think we have run out on time, and I've loved it. If people want to be in touch with you, or you want to show them what they can check out on the web, what should we highlight?
Two things. First is I'm addicted to Twitter, so I am at Krish K on Twitter. Come and say hi. Be nice to hear from your listeners, Simon. And the other thing is just visit the sanctuaryfoundation.org.uk. And there you've got loads of video resources. There's ways that you can register if you want to show that you want to welcome a Ukrainian refugee into your house or into your community or through your business or through your church. Let us know what you're able to do. And then we're putting on regular live events to help people know how to practically get involved.
Wonderful. All right, guys, action stations. That's one thing that I really want out of this, and I've seen it time and time again through this podcast, is people hear they can do something about it, they respond, so let's do it. Dr. Krish Kandiah, it's been a real treat. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
Brilliant. Well, guys, listen, I hope you've been inspired. If you have, I'd love you to give us a top quality review on Spotify or iTunes. Do pass it on to someone else. It's so good to hear these good news, challenging stories stirring us to action, isn't it? Listen, if you want to be in touch with me, it's simongilbo.com or any of the other social media platforms. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steers for the editing and Mike Sanderman for the mixing. You guys have a good week. We'll see you next time. God bless you. Toodaloo.